Welcome to our deep dive,
Yeah.
into Thomas Sowell's The Vision of the Anointed.
Yeah.
This book, it really makes you think differently about how social policy is created and who's creating it.
Yeah.
You're interested in getting to the heart of the matter quickly.
Right.
So we're going to break down Sowell's arguments and give you some real-world examples of how they play out.
Yeah. So Sowell's book, it's a critique of what he calls the Anointed.
Interesting.
He argues that this group, with its, specific worldview,
Yeah.
shapes social policies in a way that often leads to unintended consequences.
Okay, so before we go any further,
Sure.
I think we need to paint a picture of who these anointed are.
Right.
It's a catchy term.
Yeah.
But what does it actually mean, in the context of this book?
Think of those people who believe they have a superior intellect and morality,
Okay.
often found in academia, media activism, and certain political circles. They're the folks who are convinced they hold the solutions to society's problems.
So it's not necessarily about specific individuals,
Right.
but more about a particular mindset
Exactly.
or approach to social issues.
Exactly. And Sowell argues that their vision,
Yeah.
while often well-intentioned, is often divorced from reality. He's not saying these individuals are malicious,
Right.
but rather that their approach can lead to outcomes that are quite different from what they intended.
And this is where it gets interesting.
Right.
So Sowell dives into a specific example,
Yes.
the war on drugs,
Mm-hmm.
to illustrate this disconnect between vision and reality.
Right. The war on drugs was championed by many of the Anointed who saw it as a moral imperative to eradicate drug use.
Yeah.
The problem is, despite the massive resources poured into this effort,
Right.
drug use remains a significant problem.
Yes.
In fact, certain policies, like mandatory minimum sentencing for drug offenses, have been criticized for disproportionately impacting minority communities and exacerbating social inequalities.
So in this case, the Anointed's focus on a particular vision,
Right.
on the idea of a drug-free society,
Yeah.
may have actually led to unintended consequences that worsened the very problems they were trying to solve.
That's a key point.
Yeah.
Sowell argues that this tendency to prioritize a vision,
Okay.
regardless of its practical consequences, is a recurring theme in the Anointed's approach to social policy.
And it's not just about the war on drugs, right?
Absolutely.
So Will identifies this pattern in other areas as well.
Absolutely. He provides examples from areas like criminal justice reform,
Okay.
welfare programs, and education policy.
Okay.
What's consistent is that the Anointed often declare moral victories
Interesting.
based on their good intentions, even when the evidence suggests their policies are falling short.
Yeah.
Or even causing harm.
This reminds me of a story I read about a well-meaning but ultimately misguided attempt to address homelessness
Right.
in a major city. The program, championed by a group of activists and politicians, focused on providing free housing with few strings attached.
And what was the outcome of that program?
Well, it sounded good on paper. The lack of support services and accountability measures
Right.
led to a number of problems.
Yeah.
There were issues with drug use, property damage,
Yeah.
and even increased crime in the areas surrounding these free housing units.
Right.
The program ended up being scaled back significantly after a few years.
That's a perfect example of what Sowell is talking about.
Really?
The focus on a seemingly compassionate solution providing free housing overshadowed the practical considerations and ultimately led to negative consequences.
It seems like Sowell is suggesting that the Anointed's vision often follows a predictable pattern.
Right.
Can you walk us through the different stages?
Of course, Sowell breaks down the progression of the Anointed's vision into several stages.
Okay.
First, they identify a problem, often presenting it in stark and dramatic terms,
Got it.
to evoke an emotional response.
So they're good at grabbing people's attention
Exactly.
and making them care about the issue.
Exactly. The next stage is proposing a solution,
Okay.
which usually involves government intervention or some form of social engineering.
And this is where their faith in their own intellect and moral superiority comes into play.
Precisely. They believe they have the knowledge and the right to design solutions for others.
Yeah.
The crucial part is the next step.
Okay.
They often disregard or downplay any negative consequences that arise from their solution.
So if the program doesn't work as planned,
Yeah.
or if there are unintended side effects,
Right.
they're quick to dismiss those issues or blame external factors.
Exactly. It's a way of protecting their vision and their own sense of righteousness. And finally, they move on to the next problem, often without acknowledging or learning from the failures of the previous one.
It's a cycle that allows them to maintain their position as the saviors.
Right.
Without ever having to truly confront the limitations of their approach.
Yeah.
But how does this tendency to disregard evidence manifest in their communication?
Sowell highlights the power of language in shaping public perception and advancing the Anointed's agenda.
Okay.
He dissects how they use rhetoric to frame issues, often resorting to emotionally charged language.
This makes me think about how certain terms and phrases have become almost untouchable in public discourse.
Exactly. Terms like social justice, equality, or the disadvantaged are often used to shut down dissenting opinions.
Interesting.
Anyone who questions policies framed under these banners risks being labeled as insensitive or even morally corrupt.
So by controlling the language,
Right.
they can control the debate
Exact.
and make it difficult for alternative perspectives to gain traction.
That's a key part of Sowell's argument.
Okay.
He's saying that the Anointed's vision often relies on painting a very black and white picture of the world.
But the world is rarely that simple.
Yeah, exactly. Social issues are incredibly complex, and solutions that sound good in theory often have unintended consequences in practice.
Yeah.
And that leads us to the big question.
Okay.
Is Sowell's critique fair?
That's what I'm wrestling with.
Yeah.
It's clear he's making some bold claims, but he also presents a lot of compelling evidence.
Right.
What do you think? Is this a case of a cynical critic tearing down well-meaning efforts? Or is there something more to it?
It's important to remember that Sowell's book has sparked a lot of debate.
Yeah.
Some praise him for his sharp insights and intellectual honesty, while others criticize his work as being too cynical
Right.
or even politically motivated.
I can see how his ideas would be polarizing,
Yeah.
especially for those who might identify with the Anointed group. What's important for our deep dive is to present Sowell's arguments objectively,
Right.
so you can form your own conclusions.
Yes.
We've unpacked the concept of the Anointed
Right.
and explored how their vision shapes their approach to social policy. Now we need to examine how this plays out in the real world.
Yeah.
So let's move beyond the theoretical and look at some concrete examples
Okay.
of where the Anointed's vision has had a significant impact,
Right.
for better or for worse.
Exactly. One area where Sowell's critique really hits home is in education policy.
Okay. I'm intrigued. How does the concept of the Anointed apply to education?
Think about the push for progressive education reforms,
Okay.
often championed by academics and policymakers who believe they know what's best for students.
So we're talking about things like shifting away from traditional testing methods,
Right.
emphasizing self-esteem over academic rigor, or promoting a more student-centered approach to learning.
Exactly. These ideas, while often presented as being more equitable and inclusive, can have unintended consequences.
Okay.
Sowell argues that by lowering academic standards or de-emphasizing core knowledge
Right.
in favor of feel-good approaches, we may be doing students a disservice,
Interesting.
especially those from disadvantaged backgrounds.
So instead of helping to close the achievement gap,
Right.
these policies might actually be widening it.
That's the concern Sowell raises.
Okay.
He points to studies that show a decline in academic performance following the implementation of certain progressive education reforms. Of course, correlation doesn't equal causation.
Right.
And these issues are complex, but it does raise questions about whether the Anointed's vision for education is truly serving the best interests of all students.
It seems like Sowell is challenging us to look beyond the surface appeal of these ideas
Exactly.
and to really scrutinize the evidence. Are these policies actually leading to better outcomes for students?
Precisely. And that leads us to another key aspect of Sowell's critique, the reliance on experts. He argues that the Anointed place an excessive faith in the ability of experts to solve complex social problems.
This reminds me of something you mentioned earlier about the cult of expertise.
Right. It's the idea that only those with certain credentials or within a particular intellectual circle possess the knowledge and wisdom to address societal issues.
Interesting.
This can lead to a dismissal of other viewpoints.
Right.
Even if those viewpoints come from people with practical experience or different kinds of knowledge.
So a teacher who has spent years in the classroom might have valuable insights into what works and what doesn't, even if they don't have a PhD in education theory.
Absolutely. Sowell argues that valuing diverse perspectives and lived experiences can lead to more effective and practical solutions
Okay.
than relying solely on the pronouncements of experts, no matter how well-intentioned those experts may be.
This is making me rethink my own assumptions about expertise. I've always been inclined to trust those with fancy degrees or impressive titles, but I'm starting to see how that can sometimes be a trap.
It's about finding a balance.
Okay.
We can respect expertise without blindly accepting every pronouncement from those who claim it.
Right.
And perhaps even more importantly, we can recognize the value of other forms of knowledge and experience, even if they don't come with fancy titles or degrees.
This is a lot to unpack.
It is.
If we're questioning the vision of the Anointed, what alternatives might be worth considering?
Right.
Is there a different approach to social policy that might lead to better outcomes?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And to be fair to Sowell, he doesn't offer a single prescriptive alternative vision.
Okay.
Instead, he seems to be encouraging a more nuanced and multifaceted approach, one that values individual liberty, personal responsibility, and a recognition of the complexity of human affairs.
So rather than relying on top-down solutions designed by a select few?
He's suggesting that we need to empower individuals and communities to find solutions that work for them.
That's one way to interpret his argument.
Okay.
He seems to be suggesting that the most sustainable solutions often arise from individuals and communities grappling with problems on the ground, rather than being imposed from above by those who believe they know best.
I'm starting to see how this connects back to the cult of expertise idea.
Right.
By empowering people to solve problems at a local level, you're tapping into a wider range of knowledge and experience. You're also acknowledging that there's no one-size-fits-all solution to complex social issues.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that people are often best equipped to address the challenges they face within their own communities. And it's about fostering a sense of ownership and responsibility, rather than relying on government or experts to solve every problem.
This is a refreshing perspective.
It is.
It's a bit humbling, too.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that none of us have all the answers.
And that we need to be open to different approaches.
Absolutely.
This is a refreshing perspective.
Yeah.
It's a bit humbling, too.
Right.
It's a reminder that none of us have all the answers.
Exactly.
And that we need to be open to different approaches.
I think that's one of the most valuable takeaways from Sowell's work.
Okay.
He's challenging us to be more intellectually humble, to question our own assumptions, and to be willing to learn from others, even those who hold different viewpoints.
So while Sowell doesn't provide a step-by-step roadmap for a better society, he's offering us a set of principles and a way of thinking that can guide our own efforts to create positive change.
And he's urging us to be wary of simple solutions and grand narratives.
Right.
Social issues are messy and complex.
Yeah.
And they require careful consideration, a willingness to experiment, and a humble acknowledgement of our own limitations.
This has been really eye-opening. I'm starting to see the world through a new lens.
Good.
One that's more attuned to the nuances and complexities of social policy.
That's what we hope to achieve with this deep dive.
Yeah.
It's about giving you the tools to think critically and to engage with these issues in a more informed and thoughtful way.
It feels like Sowell is urging us to, move beyond these simplistic labels.
He is.
And ideological battles, and to engage with these issues, in a more nuanced and pragmatic way.
And that brings us to another crucial aspect of Sowell's critique.
Right.
The use of rhetoric and emotional manipulation.
Right.
He argues that the Anointed often rely on emotionally charged language to advance their agenda, framing complex issues in a way that discourages critical thinking and demonizes opposing viewpoints.
We touched on this earlier.
Yeah.
Can you give us some concrete examples of how this plays out in real-world discussions?
Think about the debates around climate change.
Okay.
So Sowell would likely argue that the way this issue is often framed as an existential crisis requiring immediate and drastic action leaves little room for nuance or dissenting opinions. Those who question the severity of the problem or the proposed solutions are often labeled as deniers.
Right.
Or accused of being anti-science.
It's like the conversation becomes more about moral posturing and virtue signaling than about finding practical and effective solutions.
Exactly. And this type of rhetoric can stifle productive dialogue and prevent us from exploring alternative perspectives or solutions.
So how do we break free from this trap of emotional manipulation?
Right.
And engage in more constructive conversations about these complex issues?
Sowell doesn't offer a simple answer, but his work points toward a few key principles.
Okay.
First, we need to be aware of the ways in which language can be used to manipulate our emotions and cloud our judgment. Second, we need to cultivate a healthy skepticism towards those who claim a monopoly on truth or virtue,
Oh,
especially those who resort to ad hominem attacks or appeals to emotion rather than evidence-based arguments.
it sounds like it's about becoming more discerning consumers of information, learning to recognize and filter out the noise and distortion
Yes,
that often surrounds these debates.
precisely. And that requires effort.
Right.
We need to be willing to seek out diverse perspectives, to engage with those who hold different views, and to be open to changing our own minds when presented with compelling evidence.
Yeah.
It's about cultivating intellectual humility and recognizing that none of us have all the answers.
So in a way, Sowell's work is a call to action,
It is.
an invitation to become more active and engaged citizens, not just in terms of voting or political activism, but also in how we think and talk about these important issues.
It's about reclaiming the power of critical thinking, of reasoned debate, and of evidence-based decision-making.
Yeah.
And it's about recognizing that social change is a complex and ongoing process
Right.
that requires patience, humility, and a willingness to learn from our mistakes.
This has been an incredibly thought-provoking deep dive.
Good, I'm glad to hear that.
As we wrap up our exploration of the vision of the Anointed, what's the one key takeaway you hope our listener walks away with?
I think the most important message is this.
Okay.
Be skeptical, be curious, and be willing to challenge your own assumptions.
Okay.
Don't be afraid to ask tough questions,
Right.
to seek out diverse perspectives, and to engage in respectful but rigorous debate. The future of our society depends on our ability to have these difficult conversations in a way that is both honest and productive.
That's a powerful message to leave us with.
Yeah.
The Vision of the Anointed is a challenging book, but it's also an incredibly important one.
It is.
It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our society,
Yeah.
and it equips us with the tools to think more critically about the challenges we face.
And ultimately, it empowers us to become more active and informed participants in shaping a better future for ourselves and for generations to come.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Absolutely.
We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking.
Yeah.
Until next time, keep asking those tough questions.